Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and Colin Robertson, the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, and Kate Hansenborn. My name is Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff. I direct the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund, and I will be your host today. So today, we would like to present and discuss with you the NATO shadow strategic concept of 2022. It is being released today. In fact, a half hour ago it went live. It will be on the website of the German Marshall Fund and subsequently on the websites of our two partner organizations in this endeavor. Now, it is no secret that since 2010, when the last strategic concept of NATO was released, the strategic environment has changed dramatically. Russia's threat and aggression against Ukraine and its challenge of the European security order is only the latest, and it is a very stark reminder, but it is by far not the only factor leading to this project, but it reminds us of its urgency. So therefore, that new strategic concept is to be released in June of 2022. And so in the run-up of the June release, the Alphen group, and I'll get to what that actually is in a second, is presenting today a shadow concept to inform the process leading up to the June concept, to present ideas leading into that concept, to prioritize ideas, and to just generally add creative impulses to the debate around the upcoming strategic concept. This is not your regular think tank paper. It is not just an analytic exercise that we so often do and rightfully do and oftentimes successfully do. This is different. This is a shadow concept. This is a document that mirrors the style, and we hope some or a lot of the content of the upcoming concept. So who is the Alphen group? The Alphen group is a group of a couple of dozen, maybe 30 by now, Western security experts, different countries, chaired by Julian Lindley-French, who you'll see on the screen, who will speak and whom I will introduce in just a minute. And in full disclosure, I should say I am also a member of this group, so I am not your neutral host. I've been involved in this process, something that everybody who joins this call should know. So the event today, the presentation will conduct as follows. We will have two presenters that will present for 10 minutes what's in the shadow concept. We have two commentators who will respond to them about 7 minutes. If they go wayward and way overboard, I will make myself heard and remind them that we only have a 75-minute event here. There will be a Q&A session, and since this is a large number of participants, the one and only and best way is the Q&A function. So please ask questions to the panelist, identify the panelist, ask it as a question, and there's a good chance I will pick it up or will cluster it in the conversation thereafter. Finally, I would like to thank my colleagues at the German Marshall Fund, Ronja, Alexandria, Matt, for putting us live here today. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers. First of all, Julian Lindley-French, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Statecraft in London, has many titles and many affiliations. Importantly, he's the Eisenhower Professor for Defense Strategy at the Netherlands Defense Academy. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that he has a new book out, Future War and Defense of Europe, together with two generals, John Allen and Ben Hodges. And he's the chairman, as I mentioned, of the Alphen Group and the key drafter of this report, being helped greatly by a number of others, amongst them Sandy Vershbow, distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, former, many of us know him as the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2012 to 2016. So he's been through a bit of Russian incursion in Ukraine himself. He also was an ambassador to Russia, to Korea, and to NATO. Welcome, Sandy. Then Kimberly Kagan, and I'm allowed to call her Kim, as she told me before, founder, president of the Institute of the Study of War, military historian, taught at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, at Yale, Georgetown, American University, and has conducted strategic reviews for theater commanders in Iraq. Welcome, Kim. And finally, and we are going to have you speak in this order, finally, Nico Lange, who until very recently was the chief advisor to the now former German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, her chief of the executive staff, also in his role in the CDU Conservative Party in Germany, the head of strategic planning and international policy. So welcome, Nico Lange. I should mention that he was just on a GMF study tour and we spent some quality time in Kyiv together. He is also he's also lived and worked in Ukraine and in Russia, so is a regional expert on those issues. Welcome, Nico. And with that opening little salvo, I would like to turn it over to Julian. Fire away.
Thank you, Thomas, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me first begin by thanking you and your wonderful team, as well as the Norwegian Atlantic Commission and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute for supporting the Alphen Group so wonderfully during this process and making this event possible. We all very much appreciate your efforts. Let me first begin by giving you two quotes from the tag Shadow NATO Strategic Concept. Quote 1, Strategic Concept 2022 is a politico-strategic vision, not a military strategic concept. But any such a vision must be based on effective military power. Therefore, its primary focus is on identifying the principles, parameters, and guidance necessary for the development of the right policies, strategic operational planning, and force structure and capabilities. This includes improved transatlantic burden sharing and the creation by 2030 of a more balanced alliance in which the European allies produce a sufficiency of capabilities and enablers for them to take more responsibility alongside the United States for collective defense and as credible first responders in the event of crises and emergencies, end quote. Quote 2, Strategic Concept 2022 builds on the NATO 2030 agenda by making the alliance both more effective and more efficient through greater political cohesion, the improved readiness, capability and capacity of allied armed forces, enhanced resilience, more equitable burden sharing, a reinforced NATO-EU relationship, which we believe to be vital, and strengthened function-driven partnerships. Better NATO preparedness to meet the threats posed by emerging and disruptive technologies, both to the functioning of our open democratic societies and in the future battle space, is also central to Strategic Concept 2022. When we decided to undertake this project, we wanted to highlight the main issues NATO must address and the tests the forthcoming real strategic concept must pass. To that end, the TAG Shadow NATO Strategic Concept operationalizes NATO 2030 in light of the threats the alliance must engage going forward and the strategic environment with which it must contend if it is to remain credible in its core missions. We also reaffirm critically the vital role of defending our shared values as democracies as the foundation of our legitimate alliance. The core message is in effect thus: the Ukrainian crisis puts into stark relief NATO's coming political and military challenge out to 2030 and beyond. At the heart of our strategic concept is a reaffirmation of the alliance's three core missions of collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security, but reconceived for a new geopolitical age, demanding of Europeans, we Europeans, far greater strategic ambition, underpinned by far greater strategic responsibility for our own defense. There are 10 core issues. 1, deterrence, defense, and resilience. Neither deterrence nor defense will be credible going forward unless a partnership with the nations and the EU is established as a priority to make our societies more resilient in the face of corrosive warfare. 2, adaptation, transformation, and a 360-degree alliance. We reinforce the need for the alliance to be continually adapting, indeed transforming, if it is to meet a host of risks, challenges, threats, and indeed opportunities that range from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. 3, combating terrorism. We call for a clear definition of where best NATO can help our allies deal with terrorism and the vital role of partnerships and defense capacity building. 4, burden sharing. We understand the need for more equitable burden sharing if the United States is to continue to guarantee European security and defense through the alliance, and given the worldwide challenges with which Washington must contend. 5, European strategic responsibility. We call for increased NATO-centric European strategic responsibility and a clear understanding and acceptance of the costs, burdens, and risks that we Europeans will need to bear collectively if the alliance is to continue to fulfill its duty to its citizens. 6, closing the deterrence gap. The Ukraine crisis has revealed the existence of a deterrence gap in the east of the alliance that must be plugged by more forces with better capability at a higher state of readiness and able to move and fight together. 7, NATO's world. We do not call for a global NATO, but a NATO that is firmly embedded in the real world and is able to assist the US cope with the consequences of China's rise. 8, arms control. We reconfirm the centrality of our Euro-Atlantic security and defense alliance to peace, security, and stability in Europe through reinvigorated arms control. 9, human security. We call on the alliance to play its full role where possible in wider security, including climate change and women, peace, and security. And 10, this must be a game-changing strategic concept, which is why the Alphen Group has written what we believe is a game-changing shadow strategic concept, and we recommend it to you. To conclude, ultimately, NATO is a politico-military alliance, the core business of which is deterrence, and its critical asset, legitimate fighting power. Therefore, NATO's future credibility as a defensive alliance will rely on NATO balancing firepower, people power, and tech power to meet the challenge of multi-domain warfare in a digital age. The center of gravity of the next strategic concept must be the force concept and force structure. And these are already being driven by the Concept for the Deterrence and Defence of Euro-Atlantic Area, or DDA, and SACEUR's Area of Responsibility-wide Strategic Plan, as well as the family of plans that underpin both strategies that are already forging greater coherence in the alliance. That's the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen. The commitment made at the June 2021 summit to implement these initiatives and related work on force structures must thus be a central theme in the real strategic concept, because this is where NATO truly adds value and must also be driven forward to some form of culminating point, an outcome, if you like, which is why the centerpiece of the Alphen Group's NATO shadow strategic concept is our call for a new European-led, US and Canada-friendly Allied Command Operations Mobile Heavy Force, or AMHF. Thomas, thank you.
Thank you, Julian. And yes, I can second the recommendation to read it, and it is now possible to read it. Over to Sandy.
Thanks very much, Thomas. And it's a great pleasure to be with you today to help launch the Alphen Group's Shadow Strategic Concept. I have the dubious honor of having been involved in all three of the previous post-Cold War strategic concepts in my early assignments at NATO in 91 and 99, and again in 2010 when I was working at the Pentagon. And I'm glad to have the chance to shape the new one, at least vicariously, thanks to Julian's initiative, and thanks to our three sponsors for making this possible. The 2022 edition of the strategic concept will be the most challenging yet, given the unprecedented complexity of the security environment that NATO now faces. Our shadow strategic concept tries to address multiple new threats: systemic rivalry with China, climate change, and emerging disruptive technologies, along with internal challenges to NATO's cohesion and decision-making. As Julian said, for NATO to succeed in dealing with all these formidable challenges, the new strategic concept needs to be a game changer. Now, that said, the strategic concept's value will be judged primarily on how well it prepares the alliance to deal with the old threat. That is still the most immediate and pressing: an aggressive, revanchist Russia that is waging a multidimensional war against the West, with the goal of overturning the rules-based order and reversing the changes in Europe following the end of the Cold War. An effort that would take Europe back to the days of spheres of influence. Our shadow strategic concept offers a bleak assessment of Russia's pattern of aggressive coercion and its expanding toolkit of conventional, nuclear, and hybrid capabilities that confront NATO in multiple theaters and multiple domains, as well as the growing threat to vital undersea and space-based communications. The document reaffirms the two-track approach of deterrence and dialogue that NATO adopted after 2014 and pledges to uphold the NATO-Russia Founding Act, although I have to say this is a commitment that may need to be reevaluated between now and the Madrid summit if Russia continues to violate this and other post-Cold War agreements, as it's doing in the crisis with Ukraine. Now, our main recommendations on Russia focus on strengthening defense and deterrence and keeping pace with the changing nature of war as we describe it in the shadow strategic concept. Especially relevant today is the recommendation to expand NATO's forward presence beyond what was decided in 2016 into a more robust, continuous forward presence from Estonia to Turkey. NATO may need to get started on this even before Madrid in light of Russia's new normal of provocative behavior along NATO's borders. The shadow strategic concept also reaffirms NATO's commitment to arms control and disarmament, which is taking on renewed importance as a means of de-escalating or trying to de-escalate the current confrontation over Ukraine and to manage the strategic competition with Russia over the long term. Now, on Ukraine, where the rules-based order is under the direct assault, we suggest a more proactive, strategy-driven approach to NATO partnerships, including a Ukraine deterrence initiative. That would make it a strategic priority for the alliance to do everything possible short of an Article 5 guarantee, to help Ukraine and other partners that are threatened by Moscow to defend themselves and deter aggression. This Ukraine Deterrence Initiative could be an extension of the Enhanced Opportunity Partners Program at a time when NATO membership for Ukraine is clearly not on the agenda. The shadow strategic concept also highlights the growing importance of NATO's partnerships with Finland and Sweden, as well as the need to expand NATO's engagement with democratic nations from the Indo-Pacific region, building on our shared interest in bolstering the rules-based international order against China and Russia. And we also suggest that we engage with China. It's not an adversary in the same sense as Russia, by establishing a NATO-China Council. Now, China is also relevant to a second area where our shadow strategic concept calls for a departure from the status quo. As Julian outlined in his overview, we argue that the new strategic concept must commit the alliance to a step change in the balance of responsibility between the United States and the European members of the alliance, to include Canada as well. Now, this is now a strategic, this is no longer just a matter of overcoming longstanding disputes over burden sharing and defense spending between the United States and Europe. It's now a strategic necessity because the rise of China as a strategic competitor creates a US need to shift its strategic focus to the Indo-Pacific region. And in these circumstances, NATO can no longer afford its excessive reliance on the United States, either for collective defense or for crisis management and cooperative security missions beyond Europe's borders. Clearly, in an Article 5 contingency with Russia in the Baltic or Black Sea regions, the United States may not always be able to deploy adequate reinforcements to Europe because of competing demands on its forces in the Indo-Pacific. So European allies will need to be able to pick up most of the slack. Now, similarly, resource constraints and shifting priorities may also lead the US to limit its involvement in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, or at least to be more selective in when and where it engages. And that means that the United States will increasingly look to the European allies and to the European Union to shoulder more of the burden for crisis management and partner capacity building in their own neighborhood. So all of these factors, in our view, argue for a strategic turn toward a more balanced transatlantic partnership in which Europe assumes greater strategic responsibility, backed by full spectrum capabilities and enablers that would make such a rebalancing possible. And that's why we recommend a military level of ambition under which the European allies plus Canada would agree to invest sufficient resources to meet at least 50% of NATO's minimum capability requirements by the end of the decade. This would need to include fully usable forces, as well as the strategic enablers required for the European allies to conduct multiple large-scale and smaller-scale operations, whether they're within NATO or conducted autonomously within the European Union's CSDP framework. Now, ideally, these forces and capabilities should be consolidated into a single pool of European forces supported by the requisite force structures, able to act as a multi-domain, multi-purpose, high-end first responder force, fully interoperable with US forces, which, as Julian said, we call in our shadow strategic concept, the Allied Command Operations Mobile Heavy Force. Allies' agreement to this higher level of ambition would enable NATO to get past ideological debates about the meaning of strategic autonomy and focus on a more equitable division of labor, an enhanced European role in collective defense alongside the United States, and a first responder role in crisis management in and around NATO's neighborhood. Finally, let me just reinforce a core message of our shadow strategic concept, namely that the alliance should maintain the 3 core tasks established in the 2010 strategic concept, collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. But we further recommend establishing a new priority of enhanced resilience to cover the full spectrum of challenges and risks to our societies and to our armed forces. Resilience, which some people suggest should be a 4th core task, we see as cutting across all 3 and we don't suggest a change in that regard. Now, meeting the core tasks will require further strengthening and modernizing NATO's force structure, building on the decisions taken since 2016 to beef up NATO's deterrence and defense posture. NATO's multi-domain force architecture must ensure that the right forces are in the right place at the right time, and this requires creating a culture of readiness through the full implementation of the NATO Readiness Initiative beyond its headline 430s elements. And it means also ensuring full military mobility across Europe and safe transit across the increasingly contested North Atlantic. So we hope that our shadow strategic concept will inspire the drafters of the real one. We're just getting to work on drafting the real thing. And I look forward to the reactions of our guests and to our audience. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sandy. And the first question is whether this inspired our respondents or made them look at this in a more critical view. So I'm going to turn it right over to Kim Kagan for her first reaction to what she has heard, and by the way, has been able to read beforehand.
Thank you very, very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and congratulations to the Alphen group for completing an important document in this shadow concept. It is well written and well worth reading. And so I do commend it to all in the audience as an important layout of what NATO can become. What I think is most important to talk about here and now are not only the good ideas that the authors, including Julian and Sandy, have put forth, but with this incredible audience here, the urgency of the undertaking that NATO faces. Because in many respects, 2030 is not soon enough. NATO must change now, and NATO has lost the luxury of time. It must break the inertia that makes change by 2030 seem fast, because in fact, in many respects, the challenges of that we think that we will face in 2030 are really the challenges that we face right now. And over the last 30 years, NATO has operated in a world in which there was no significant Russian conventional military threat. There was some conventional military threat, as we saw, and as we have been seeing since 2014, indeed since 2008 and other times. But that world of 30 years ago is 30 years old. And it is not the world that we live in right now in 2022. NATO's strategic concept in 2010, which of course was an incredibly important document, didn't prepare us for 2014. It contained within it, of course, very important ideas that the Alliance has undertaken and undertaken to effect. But I think the question that we need to ask now that really emerges from the intersection of the publication of the shadow strategic concept and its collision with the strategic environment that exists on February 3rd, 2022, is if everything that the authors of this shadow concept recommend, or indeed everything that will appear in the forthcoming concept, were actually completed and implemented right now, would it suffice to counter Russia's mobilization against the NATO alliance right now? That, I think, is such an important question, because indeed, although we all see that Russia is putting pressure on Ukraine and military pressure and using the threat of the use of military force, Russia is putting pressure on NATO, and Putin's objective really remains to split the NATO alliance politically, militarily, and neutralize it as an effective actor, protecting the common interests of all of its member states, which include the sovereignty of those member states, but also our collective security. So with this Russia crisis, we have a NATO crisis. And of course, you know that. But let's actually talk a little bit about these conventional military challenges that Russia now presents, because as Julian and Sandy have mentioned, the essence of our collective defense and our ability to deter really lies in having a credible military response, as well as a suite of other capabilities. There are 30,000 Russian troops coming now into Belarus, and most are going to Belarus's western borders. NATO can expect to find the equivalent of 2 divisions of Russian troops on its borders. That's new. Of course, the Russians are integrating that force with Belarusian forces, S-400s, Iskanders in multiple locations, and Russian strike aircraft, which I expect will be staging out of Belarus. That changes the time-space relationship for the challenges that Russia poses. It means that Russia can act with more force faster against more of us and against our own collective responsibility. So in 2030, we must actually contemplate a geopolitical and geostrategic situation that we do not want. How are we going to defend the Baltic states? Will Russia be threatening Poland by 2030? How do we stop Russia from turning the Black Sea into a Russian lake or the Baltic Sea thereafter? And how do we deal with the hybrid warfare that Russia is conducting that goes from pure information campaigns all the way through and up to major conventional war, perhaps with the use of nuclear weapons? That's our challenge now. And so the time in which NATO needs to modernize is now. The threat that it needs to face does include its traditional purpose. And it includes the extraordinary capabilities that our adversaries will bring over the next decade, leading to conditions of hyperwar, of the requirement for fast decision-making and fast response, which will challenge our alliance very, very formidably, and especially will challenge our alliance as it faces pressure not only from Russia, but from other actors who seek to overturn the rules-based international order, such as China. So I want to encourage you to read the 2030 Shadow Strategic Concept, and I would encourage you to think about how we can make this concept valid, valuable, and executable, not in 2030, but as soon as possible. And 2022 would be a great time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I think this was a pretty strong message of urgency that raises a number of questions that I think I will put to our authors in a minute, but we'll do so only after we've heard from Nico Lange. Nico.
Thank you, Thomas. and congratulations to Julian, Sandy, Thomas, and all the other authors in the Alphen group for producing this shadow strategic concept. I hope it will be read by many who are drafting and deciding the strategic concept of NATO during the next months. And thank you for the opportunity to share a few first reflections on the paper. I will try to avoid redundancy being the fourth speaker, and will focus on two highlights and 3 points that I want to put up for discussion. A point that was not mentioned yet, but I think that is worth highlighting. I was pleased to read very early in the paper about the institutionalist perspective as NATO, as the vital transatlantic forum for discussing security matters. This seems to me a very important point, especially in a time where the United States are having their strategic reviews of their own, where NATO member states are having strategic reviews on foreign security and defense, and where the European Union for the first time is on the way to develop a first attempt at a strategic concept with a strategic compass in the future, and to have all member states of NATO recommitted to NATO as the forum for an institutionalized transatlantic exchange seems also be very valuable in the time where we have seen NATO being questioned more fundamentally between 2010 and 2020 than in decades before, even on the top level in some NATO member states. The second highlight I want to set, and this was laid out by Sandy Vershbow earlier, I had a real pleasure in reading the frame you set in the shadow concept on the burden sharing discussion. I find this very meaningful to frame this as a European strategic responsibility, also in comparison to other terms that are out there. And if the European pillar within NATO, with this strategic concept, could be committed to take over the responsibility to be a first responder in the immediate neighborhood of the European NATO members, and to be able to have high-end security and crisis management in the immediate neighborhood of the European members of NATO, I think this would be a huge step forward in the discussion on European capabilities and the European members within NATO. And while in the concept you formulate the US will remain engaged in Europe, I have the impression this could be a precondition for keeping the US engaged in Europe if the Europeans are taking this responsibility seriously upon themselves. And in combination with this idea of burden sharing, that European partners and Canada provide 1/2 of all capabilities of NATO in future, and the United States the other half, I think this is a meaningful step forward in the burden sharing discussion. The 3 remarks I want to make are on resilience, on technology, and on strategy in general. On resilience, I think an enhanced resilience is a logical and needed next element for the NATO strategic concept. And there are elements of resilience that, to my mind, seem to be a return to collective defense that we have seen in the past. Stockpiling, forward stationing, improving military mobility, maybe updating legal frameworks in certain NATO countries, including Germany, to be ready for collective defense. This is a great area, by the way, for EU-NATO cooperation or for NATO-EU cooperation. And I like the emphasis in the strategic concept on that. At the same time, there is an element of resilience that I'm a little bit at unease with, because it is a domestic dimension. It is a domestic dimension between NATO member states. Turkey comes to mind, but it's also questions of checks and balances in democratic systems, democracies, NATO member states. Does NATO as a supranational institution have instruments to implement a strategy into that direction, or can it help others to implement it? I think that those are questions that need to be discussed talking about resilience domestically. On technology, I like the emphasis in the shadow concept on keeping NATO on the technological edge. And it's extremely important to put this into the strategic concept. At the same time, the implementation questions are new territory for NATO, at least in some parts. Can we imagine a NATO Education and Research Ministers Summit or a NATO Trade and Economy Minister Summit? Because this would not only be foreign and security policy, this would be trade, intellectual property, research, technology. This would also require intergovernmental processes within member states of NATO to be capable of implementing such a strategy. This is not necessarily an argument against it, but it just means the ambition is high if such a technology strategy of NATO should be implemented. And at the same time, I was wondering whether the right perspective, and I have no answer to that, but I'm posing the question, whether the right perspective is we should do what we have done all of the time in collective defense and add measures to encounter hybrid, cyber, space, and new disruptive technologies? Or are the technologies disruptive because they change the grammar of escalation and de-escalation, because they change the calculations of waging war fundamentally, and therefore also have to be more fundamentally put into the new strategic concept? Because it's not only Russia and China, it seems to be that also some autocratic or authoritarian mid-sized power increasingly are calculating that waging war could be a cost-efficient way of pursuing political goals. And as a parenthesis, this includes a lot of procurement questions in a time where members of governments and parliaments are looking into defense procurement very often from an industrial policy and labor policy angle. That is not necessarily the angle that produces the faster innovation cycles that are needed and that you are mentioned in the paper. And of course, it includes also, I put it a little bit frankly, a tendency towards technocratic over-planning procedures within NATO and within NATO militaries that are not producing the fast innovation cycles we need. And the last remark, I mean, the task for the strategic concept is very easy. It's 360-degree credible defense and deterrence with high-end forces in the strategic environment that has changed to the worse, and where we are in danger of falling behind technologically and are internally vulnerable. And in the spirit of the old wisdom that the essence of strategy is choosing what not to do, I was wondering if crisis management, arms control, non-proliferation, climate, energy, migration, and other issues are really tasks for NATO, or if NATO should concentrate on becoming credible again and stay credible in the future in defense and deterrence of the transatlantic community in the dimensions land, sea, air, space, and cyber, since it seems to me that the task we have formulated in this discussion and that you have laid out in the paper is enormous. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. We now have a great menu to choose from, and the problem of concentrating on a few essential things. I think what I want to do with the half hour that we have, since we have a number of large-scale questions in the chat functions already, what I would like to do is ask our two speakers to respond to just a couple of questions that were raised by our two commentators that I'm going to rephrase in a second in a relatively quick way, so that within 5 or 8 minutes we can go into the chat. So the question I think that Kim raised was the question of urgency. And is what we read in this this concept ambitious enough? We have, so my ears were ringing when she said NATO has lost the luxury of time. The Belarus situation has changed the time and space relationship. Is 20 is what we're dealing with, what we're projecting for 2030. Shouldn't that be here today? So strategic environment plus political realism, where does that take you? And Sandy, Julian, how would you respond to that? That would be the first cluster. And the second is, so that Nico put three interesting elements of questions to you. You might want to choose from them. I would want to just sort of focus them. The tech question, can it be implemented or will it end in technocratic over-planning? NATO technocratic over-planning? Should we not, I mean, one of the advantages of this shadow concept is its comprehensive nature. What Nico is saying, shouldn't we be concentrated more? Those two maybe. Sandy, Julian, want to go first?
Sandy, do you want to take the first shot of that?
Okay. Thanks very much. We wanted to hear these kinds of questions and criticisms.
Yeah.
I would say to Kim, of course, you're absolutely right. And with the unfolding crisis along Ukraine's borders, with the deployments of forces in Belarus, which may become permanent, with the potential even deployment of nuclear capabilities with those Russian forces, this situation is evolving in a much more dangerous direction, even as we speak. I would say on one hand, because NATO isn't starting from scratch, even though the 2010 strategic concept became completely out of date when the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014, NATO has been working to redefine the strategy and the threat assessment de facto through the decisions being taken to strengthen deterrence and defense, starting at the Wales summit, but moving through the 2016, 2018, and 2021 summits. So we're not starting from scratch. At the same time, what we recommend is certainly a risky approach that I, as I said, see a strategic necessity, not just a nice to have, that the European members of the alliance contribute even more, including high-end capabilities, so that they can do a larger part of the collective defense mission, and take over the first responder role in crisis management, which is, we can be selective there, but we can't be selective in dealing with the Russians. And of course, previous efforts at stronger European defense have disappointed, to put it diplomatically. And Europe seems, if anything, demoralized in the current environment. I was at a dinner in Paris the other night in which a former French ambassador said, Putin has killed European defense. Europe needs to kind of pull up its socks and get serious about it, which will mean spending more money. But I think, you know, the NATO strategy is evolving quickly. The commanders have come up with these deterrence and force concepts, warfighting concepts, but it's going to take a Herculean effort to implement them. And I agree that we have to have more of a sense of urgency in the real strategic concept, or we're going to be playing catch-up ball vis-a-vis the Russians here and now, and not have that luxury of time that you warned us about. So hopefully the realities of that are already sinking in. We're seeing the U.S. as it did in 2014, taking unilateral steps to kind of motivate the rest of the alliance with the ongoing deployments to the eastern flank, which are stopgaps. They're not the permanent solution, but it shows a readiness to recognize that what has gone before since 2014 is only a starting point. We need an approach that is going to be much more focused on what is going to be a standing, permanent, multi-dimensional threat from the Russians on a daily basis. And while we may hope that diplomacy can de-escalate the immediate crisis, Putin is not going to give up his revisionist ambitions for the sake of a few arms control agreements. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sandy. I'll jump in if I may. Dealing with the issue of urgency, yeah, Kim, you're right. But this is a minimum set of standards as far as we as a group are concerned. If the alliance can't meet this set of objectives, then we're in trouble. And implicit all the way through the discussions was a need for European leaders, particularly Western European leaders, to get over their almost a mindset problem, a denial problem that the worst, the bad can never happen. I mean, what we're watching is it can. I mean, look at today. We've had the Divide and Impera initiative by Moscow to, rather than talk about NATO, to talk to each individual European country, where the objective is very, very clear. The other issue driving us was, how do you balance the broad spectrum of missions? Yes, Nico's point is right, that NATO is the ultimate warfighter as the core of its deterrent posture. But NATO's expertise, the force planning, the defense planning, all those standardization efforts over 70 plus years means that it must cover the full spectrum. And a real challenge inside the concept was, where is NATO in the lead and where are the nations in the lead with NATO behind it? And that's going to require a new concept of partnership. I'll go as far as to say the next 70 years, the next 10 years will see the equivalent of 70 past years of mainly civilian-led technology enter the battle space. And NATO's really got to grip that mentally as a concept, but it can only do that if the nations let it. And if the concept is yet another, what I regard as exercise as placing political cohesion as a public good in its own right at any cost, even if that means a lack of effectiveness, then I think there is a danger to NATO from that. And the danger is that countries like Sandy's, and perhaps my own, particularly in the naval domain, would simply step outside the institutional framework, because we cannot make this alliance work to our ends. I think that would be a tragedy myself. I believe in the institutionalization of European security because it prevents extreme state behavior. But we've also got to be effective. And the Americans will need effective allies and partners to be credible. And that's why, in a sense, the defense industrial challenge that Nico touches upon is vital. If we continue what I regard as almost a criminal past practice of seeing defense industries and the technological base as an extension of employment policy, with protected metal bashes, becoming further and further behind the cutting edge of technologies in defense, then I'm afraid we Europeans will almost deserve the fate that would face us. We have to look at reality in the face. The only way we're going to field the equipment that our forces will need at the price they can afford in the time and quality that is vital is if we look at a strategy-led European defense and technological industrial base. It is vital. There is no way around this. And we've got to overcome our parochialism and work with the Americans to generate that kind of capacity. If not, I'm afraid we will fall further and further behind. Why? Because it's technology that will drive much of the credibility of defense in the future. One final word on this. This isn't anything new. Back in 1918, the British came up with the concept of the all-arms battle. And that was the first true application of firepower before manpower, because the British were running out of manpower. In a sense, we're facing the all-arms battle of 2022, where our quality of our people, our thinking, and education is a vital enabler in this, but above all of our technology is going to be the difference between credible deterrence, which is NATO's core business, and incredible deterrence, where even ourselves do not believe in what our alliance is doing. Thomas?
Thank you, Julian. We're going straight to our Q&A from this point on. And I want to start with something that relates directly to what you just said. And it comes from Harlan Ullman, which says, and could relate to some of what you said in just a second ago. And it said, Julian, and I'm going to read this because all of it, Julian lists a range of aspirations, all noble. But how are these to be turned into strategy and actions? That has always been the challenge. Frankly, I don't see, however well written an argument this document may be, how it is to be implemented. That needs more explanation.
Well, thank you. If I may, Sandy, I always agree with Harlan and everything he says. Look, Harlan, you know as well as I do that this is a strategic concept. There'll be a series of, it'll drive planning, or at least it must drive planning. The alternative is we wait for shock. We wait for the very unpleasant to happen and try and react. And I would remind you of this. Everyone talks about appeasement before World War II. But in fact, the British began rearming in 1934. And had they not rearmed in 1934, they wouldn't have had the technologies like radar, the fighter defense structure, the Spitfire and Hurricane, and indeed the major bomber force, which played such a major role in Britain's defense in 1940 and beyond, had they not taken those decisions alongside an attempt to find a political solution. So we're not saying rearm for the sake of it. We believe in dual track, but to go to Teddy Roosevelt's famous comment, we should, as Europeans, learn to continue to speak softly, but generate a very big European stick that can help our North American allies. Thomas?
Thank you. There is another pretty fundamental question in the chat, and it comes from Hans-Uwe Mergener, who asked, shouldn't there be a rethinking of Article 5 as its scope and implications evolved over time?
Is that for me?
Choose if you like.
Yes,
Between the two,
I
maybe.
think that's a legitimate question. And hi, Uwe, nice to hear from you. This is a sense of problem that's been being worked out kind of deliberately in an evolutionary way by NATO. In 2014, Article 5 was reinterpreted to include the possibility that a cyber attack could have a sufficient level of destruction or damage to stability that it would be the functional equivalent of an Article 5 threat, legitimizing a collective response. And NATO more recently has done the same thing with regard to potential threats in outer space. So I don't think we need to change Article 5, which would be opening a can of worms. But I think the consensus has been evolving in favor of this more pragmatic, you know it when you see it, approach to cyber threats, outer space threats, and potentially future threats we haven't fully absorbed yet with the arrival of AI and other technologies.
Yeah, I'll add briefly to that if I may. By the way, much of this is in the my latest Oxford book, Future War and the Defense of Europe. The German language edition will be published this month by Cosmos, to give myself a wonderful plug. I wouldn't reconceive Article 5, but I would reconceive our concept of deterrence. When does mass disruption generate effectively the same effect as mass destruction? And I think the purpose of deterrence is to communicate to adversaries. And I do think we need to communicate to our potential adversaries across the spectrum what we regard as being sufficiently disruptive to generate effective or de facto destruction. And I think that's a vital part. Deterrence is about communication. I think that's a vital part of the concept. Thomas?
I think Nico wants to come in on Article 5.
Yeah, just a brief remark, because that's an interesting part of the shadow concept you put forward. And it has been mentioned by Secretary General Stoltenberg a few times that cyber attacks could lead to Article 5. I would like to hear more from you what that would mean. How do we deter a cyber attacks? By offensive cyber capabilities, by using other credible deterrents? What would be the consequences of using Article 5 on cyber? If you could elaborate on that a little bit more, that would be helpful.
If I jump in that first, Sandy, are you happy with that?
Yeah.
I'll have a go at that. Well, first, what's likely to happen is hybrid cyber and indeed hyperwar will be used together. There'll be no neat packages. Second, we're liable to see multiple theaters facing multiple threats at the same time if this is a genuine high-end emergency, of which NATO's European area of responsibility will be but one. Third, I'm an advocate of cyber offense, because that is ultimately whether it's deterrence in all its forms has to have an offensive component. Deterrence by denial must have an offensive component. And there are certain countries in Europe, one of which is my own, which are developing those capabilities. What we cannot do is allow adversaries to have an uncontested space. They cannot simply sit back and believe that they can take actions against democratic societies without incurring a price. And we as an alliance need to be in that business. Thomas?
Thank you. I want to go back.
I agree with that, and I would just add that we don't want to restrict ourselves.
Go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, I would say we don't want to restrict ourselves exclusively to responding in kind. That may be one way we respond. There may be situations where, and we should make this both clear and ambiguous at the same time in our declaratory policy, that we reserve the right to respond kinetically to cyber attacks, particularly if they are causing significant destruction of critical infrastructure or deaths of our population. Basically, it would be the equivalent of an armed attack, and we could respond with the force of arms.
Okay, let's go back to our Q&A. And I want to come back to a three-part question from Dan Conklin, who asks where to base the heavy force that the shadow concept talks about, how to respond to gray zone conflicts, and how to asymmetrically respond to an asymmetrically acting Russia.
If I may take the first part of that, Thomas, and thanks, Don. Great question as always, and great to hear from you. Look, it would need to be stationed somewhere south of Warsaw, because there is a deterrence gap between Szczecin, where multiple the northern MNC Northeast is based, which is meant to be NATO's unblinking eye, as Phil Breedlove called it, looking at NATO's eastern flank. So it would need to plug that 1,500-kilometer gap between MNC Northeast, Multinational Corps Northeast headquarters, and the enhanced forward presence, or what we call comprehensive forward presence, because that would be a strong message of deterrence. Now, if Russia complains about that, well, the response would be, well, Russia, your behavior has triggered this, and therefore this is simply a consequence of your behavior. So you have no right to complain. The current estimates of a few thousand NATO troops being sent into the area compare with well over 120,000 Russian troops being moved in from their side. So it's a question of proportion. Proportionality is always important. What do we do in the immediate future? We move HQ Allied Rapid Reaction Corps from Innsmouth in Gloucestershire, because it's the most capable NATO deployable corps, to that new headquarters somewhere near Warsaw. It's reinforced by a US corps, and then that becomes a development headquarters for the future Allied mobile heavy force. I hope that answers your question, Don.
Jakub Godzimirski is asking about energy security, which is mentioned in the report, how to cope with NATO's energy dependence on Russia. That is the main challenge and the main energy supplier to European members. Maybe, Sandy, you want to start on this one?
Yeah, I think this is an area where NATO largely has both a supporting role and at the same time can be a forum for raising consciousness, raising awareness through intelligence exchanges. But NATO isn't a policy-making or decision-making body to set European policies on reducing dependence on Russian energy. But it is a factor in going forward in the nature of the threats we face. So I think expanding consultations within the Alliance on energy security, something we've been trying to do for decades, should be given higher priority, even if NATO isn't the decision maker in this field.
My personal view is that if we need more realism in Europe on defense, we need more realism in Europe on energy security. The idea that we're going to achieve net zero by 2050 by effectively becoming part of the Russian Federation, because we're scrapping all our other forms of energy generation. I think of Germany's decision to scrap its nuclear power stations while Britain is actually building new nuclear power stations. Whilst we have large amounts of gas under Northern England, huge amounts, which could be fracked as a transitional energy source to lessen our reliance on aggressive powers like Russia, whilst we still move towards renewables. But to simply set an arbitrary objective and then start cutting our own sources of energy to achieve that, and that the consequence is greater reliance on an unreliable partner like Russia, strikes me as strategic illiteracy of the worst kind. Thomas?
Strategic illiteracy of the worst kind. Can you quote you with that?
Please do.
Please do. Okay, Claude Zanardi wants to know more about the concept that this shadow concept includes about NATO and EU, the NATO-EU relationship, and wants you to elaborate more on it. I'm guessing that might be Julian.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, as a committed European, I think I should take that question. Look, this concept presupposes a deep and abiding strategic partnership between the Alliance and the Union, because the scale of offensive and defensive requirement requires transnational solutions and organization. Cyber has no border, information has no border. And because of that, we need to work as a collective block, if you like, and use our institutions to generate effect. And that will need a much deeper, privileged or strategic partnership, whatever you want to call it, between the two institutions. Now, roughly, that will mean, along the lines of what Nico said, that NATO will be the sword, in the sense of it will be the credible sword that is credible in the minds of anyone who would attack us. The EU in Europe would be the shield, in as much as it would work with the member states to help build regulatory and practical frameworks for enhanced civil defense. Because it's done this for 40 plus years. It's been that integrator of our regulatory frameworks, and to have an effective civil defense, which if we cannot protect our people, NATO's ability to project stabilizing, deterring power will be critically undermined. And the Union has a vital role to play in this. And I think CSTP in particular. One point I would suggest we need to resolve. Stoltenberg said in November 2019 that 80% of all defensive power of Europe is now outside the European Union with Brexit.
Outside NATO.
Outside NATO, sorry. Well, I actually said outside the EU.
Oh, you're correct. Sorry.
Yeah, and we need to ensure that the third country arrangements, whereby these third countries can take part in EU flagged operations, and there'll be more of them because the EU flag is a very useful identity to put operations under during crises. They must be able to have a say over the shape of an operation if they are contributing major elements of it. And I can tell you in my conversation with London, we will not commit our forces unless we have a say over the shape of operations. And as you know, we can commit very considerable forces and even more so in the coming future. Sandy.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think there has to be a political decision that sticks inside the European Union to coordinate all this through NATO with the NATO defense planning process. We can't afford to have competing frameworks for setting force requirements and trying to achieve industrial cooperation. This has to be a partnership. There have to be flexible command arrangements so that EU-led operations can draw on NATO intelligence, command and control based on agreed protocols and not try to make it up as you go along. So this is all very ambitious. These things have been tried in the past. We had the Berlin Plus initiative. They found it over political disputes between whether Turkey can become a partner in an EU-led operation. But unless we address these political issues, this isn't going to work.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes to go. I have one question that is a clarifying question from the chat that I would like to put to Julian. We will have to forego a set of interesting questions pertaining to how to operationalize some of the wider ranging issues, climate. There's a couple of climate questions here on cyber, on space, on Arctic. We can't get that done in our time space because I would like to give the last words to Kim and Nico to sum up what they have heard in this conversation, whether that changes their perspective on what they've initially read and how they would sum up and comment on the conversation that we have had. So the question in the chat is on the stationing south of Warsaw, how to sort that out with agreements concluded with Russia after the 1990s. I assume that the NATO-Russia Founding Act that is being referred to here, Julian.
Thank you. Well, Sandy might want to comment on this as well, but briefly, there was no formal agreement. There was almost like so dare I say it, a gentleman's agreement that it wouldn't happen as long as Russia didn't take aggressive actions. Russia has now taken aggressive actions. Whether they keep pushing this idea that there's a firm agreement, there wasn't. And even if there was, should we say, an implicit agreement, their own actions in Crimea and elsewhere have negated any sway they have over the choices this NATO must make to defend its members. So whatever we need to do to deter and defend as an alliance, we have every right to do within the framework of NATO territory.
Last words to Kim and Nico. And Nico, I would specifically, when you got the very last word, maybe to respond to Julian's statement about his perception of the NATO-Russia Founding Act and how that would play with a German perception here. Kim, fire away.
Thank you so much. And again, congratulations to Julian and to Sandy. Do read their truly excellent report here, their Shadow Strategic Concept. I think that they have published at a time that really brings into focus the requirements that face the NATO alliance. And the requirements will grow. They will not shrink. They will not go away. And I think the document that they have put forth and so wonderfully described today makes an important case for change and an important case for change within Europe. And I want to say thank you for doing that. I think the Transatlantic Alliance is an amazing and wonderful institution, and it rests on the transatlantic component, the European component. And it is wonderful to see the emphasis that Julian and Sandy and their co-authors have placed on strengthening this partnership so that it is the equal partnership that is envisioned in NATO's founding and executed in NATO's future. So thank you.
Over for last words of wisdom from Nico Lange.
I'm not sure if I can provide or should provide words of wisdom. I also cannot give a legal perspective on NATO-Russia Founding Act or on 2+4 treaty with regards to Germany. But I will give a political answer to that one. As Julian said, a credible deterrence is about communications. And of course, comprehensive forward presence can also play a role in communication in order to deter. And my last remark would be coming back to the technology issue. It would, of course, be great to clarify, and it seems to be necessary to clarify what the deep transatlantic security relationship is. And there are excellent suggestions in the paper. If this could be accompanied by initiative that in research and technology and industry, Europe and the US will solve, let's say, hypersonic and interfractal factual orbit bombardment and other technological issues where we have the difficulty that for the first time we have a tendency of falling behind. If we can solve this together as Europe and the US, I think that would be a really credible strategic addition to that.
Yeah.
That was what you said. It was going to be a word of wisdom at the end, I find, because of especially that major point that you made at the very end, Nico. I want to thank all participants in this launch event. I would like to thank our participants online. I would like to encourage you not only to read it, but also to circulate it, to circulate the ideas in it. I think I can speak for Sandy and for Julian and the group that they will be happy to receive, if you so think it is valuable, invitations to further circulate the concept in your respective circles. I think they would be happy to look at that. So thank you very much. And with that, have a good day.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Thomas.
Thank you all.